What's happening in Mississippi? You have found the Sit Down with Russ Latino, where we explore the ideas and people that are shaping Mississippi's future. For our first show of the year, we're joined by, I call him the Forrest Gump of Mississippi politics. I don't know that that's flattering or not.
I've been called worse.
But Brad White has been in Mississippi politics for a very, very long time. Was the Mississippi Republican Party chairman at one point, worked with Dick Hall at MDOT. Has been chief of staff at the state auditor's office when state auditor Stacey Pickering was there, was chief of staff for former Senator Thad Cochran, for current Senator Cindy Hyde-Smith, and then for Governor Tate Reeves. In his current role, he oversees one of the largest agencies in the state of Mississippi, the Mississippi Department of Transportation. Obviously important because Mississippians drive more than almost every other state to and from work. It's how we get our kids to and from the soccer field, the baseball diamond, and to and from church every Sunday. So roads and bridges are an important part of government. And with the legislative session getting back into the swing of things, there's going to be an awful lot of conversation about how do we continue to improve our road and bridge system? What does it look like to have a sustainable funding stream for that system? And Brad will have all the answers to those questions. Before we get into all that, I mean, I joked about you being the Forrest Gump of Mississippi politics, obviously. I'm just saying you've been around for a long time. Given everything that you've done, what are like the big lessons that you've learned from every stop along the way? Because you've had some great mentors if you think about some of the people that you've worked with and for.
Right. I mean, I think staying humble was probably the biggest lesson. Watching Senator Cochran, I learned a lot from him and the way that he dealt with people. But toward the end of his time in office, when his health failed and when we recognized that he was going to retire, but we had this large omnibus bill coming out of appropriations that we had to pass into law to fund the government before he could retire, that we were just trying to land the retirement properly. And in a city like Washington, you know, most people, that's as soon as there's a little blood in the water, all the sharks come to feed. And with Senator Cochran, you were able to see from people like Chuck Schumer to Mitch McConnell and all those senators in between, everyone had an interest in making sure he was able to retire with dignity. And that taught me a lot, just saying, you know, he built up the equity in that bank account of friendships around, and everyone respected him, everybody liked him, even if they disagreed with him. And no one wanted to see him retire with any other way but in a dignified manner. And so that made me take note and say, you know, I want to be a Thad Cochran as much as I can be, so that when my time comes like that everybody's wanting to be helpful more so than feeding at the trough.
Yeah, you know, obviously politics, there are a lot of blunt instruments.
Right.
And sometimes you need a blunt instrument. Sometimes blunt instruments get things done. It strikes me listening to you talk about Senator Cochran's manner, and of course, Mississippians got to see it as well, but you got to see it in a different way. You get to see it up close and personal in a friendship capacity and an employee capacity. That he was not a blunt instrument. In a lot of ways, if he had walked into the room, for a lot of people, they would have thought he was unassuming.
They may have not even noticed that he walked in. He at the time of his retirement, he was the longest serving member of Congress. He was the only senator left from the Nixon era, chairman of appropriations, but he was just a very humble, what you saw was what you get kind of guy. And you look at people like Senator Trent Lott, who in many ways was more successful than Thad. He knew how to wield power, and he knew how to deal in the political world. I mean, he defeated Senator Cochran for majority leader. But when he had a slip up and became a little vulnerable, it was his quote-unquote friends that kind of went on the attack. Senator Cochran, on the other hand, when he became vulnerable toward the end due to his health, I mean, it was the people that we would consider his quote-unquote enemies or opposition that were among the first to come to his side and say, let's help him retire with dignity. And so watching that, it had a big impact on the way I view life, because we're not going to be here forever. So, you know,
and you were the Republican Party chairman when in relation to Haley Barbour?
His second term.
His second term.
He asked me to run for chairman leading into his second term after he was reelected, and I served then. So that would have been 2000, into 2007 through 2011.
how did that come about for you? Because you've been involved, I guess, in quote unquote Republican Party politics since you were a teenager. Is that right?
There was a guy back home. I'm from Simpson County. That was a local mayor. He was mayor of Weathersby, which is no longer a town, and then later mayor of Mendenhall. And he was a Republican back in the 50s and 60s when there were very few Republicans. And as such, he came to know Kirk Fordyce through the Republican Party back in the 60s. And so when Governor Fordyce decided to run for office in 1991, Ray Layton got involved in his campaign, and I was 14 at the time. And he told my parents, we're going to make a Republican out of this boy, because back then everybody was Democrat in a rural county like Simpson. And so that started everything. And leading into, after Governor Fordyce was reelected, leading into the 1996, when the party was going to reorganize and elect county leadership, state leadership, national leadership, we thought Mr. Ray was going to be our new Republican county chairman. And he passed away suddenly, unexpectedly. And the others on the committee and all just decided, I guess, to roll the dice on a weird teenager. And I was elected county chairman, became the youngest county chairman in the nation. And that started my role in Republican Party leadership. Up until then, I was just kind of helping him put out yard signs. But of course, as a county chairman, you start having to hire poll workers, put on primary elections, recruit candidates, do all the things necessary to try to build a party, and hopeful to see a party develop that can take the philosophy of government that the Republican Party stands for or should stand for, and then translate that into public policy. So it was kind of accidental, I guess you'd say. Had Mr. Ray lived, I would have just continued being the little yard sign lackey.
Well, I asked that question about where you were in relation to Haley. I had a conversation with Haley a couple of weeks ago after Mr. Clark Reed passed away, and he was just talking about his beginning with Clark and what that was like. And he was mentioning that at the time that he got his start doing some of the same sort of lackey work that you're describing that you did early on, that I think that there was no member of the legislature that identified as a Republican, and only 3 mayors across the entire state.
3 mayors. You had Mac McAllister from Lauderdale County was in the House of Representatives. He was elected in, I think, 1963, the year that Rubel Phillips ran. So he would have been the only Republican on the blip around state politics at that time. But I'm sure the governor told you, Governor Barber's first poll he ever saw, 6% of the state identified as Republicans. Now, in 1964, when Wirt Yerger was running the campaign for Goldwater, Senator Goldwater, I think over 80-something% of the state voted for Goldwater, giving him one of the biggest victory he had in the whole country, other than his home state. So.
Yeah, no, it's incredible to think about, because I think sometimes, obviously Mississippi's politics at this point, people identify it with being a deep red, quote unquote, Republican state, right? And I think some of that is very recent history. I mean, even like if you look at Governor Barber as an example, I mean, clearly Kirk Fordyce had come before that, but Kirk Fordyce had been an outlier. And then what the legislature didn't fully turn, both the Senate and the House, to 2011 or 2012?
Well, when Governor Barber was elected in 2003, he had a Democrat-controlled House, a Democrat-controlled Senate, a Democrat lieutenant governor, a Democrat speaker. It was not until his second term that Amy Tuck had changed parties. We ended up with the election of 2007. You had some senators that started changing parties and running again as Republicans that gave us the Republican majority of the Senate for the first time. But yeah, I mean, he governed and accomplished quite a bit with, I would say, a conservative majority, but at that time you still had some conservatives that identified as Democrats.
And obviously part of these conversations when you get into like party history is a recognition, one, that parties oftentimes are actually driven by the personalities that end up leading those parties. And because of that, political movements change, right? What it means to be a Republican or a Democrat over the course of a history changes dramatically, a lot of times because of the leadership within those organizations at a local level, and then candidly at the national level as well.
I think that was one of the things that we saw with the election of Kirk Fordyce is Kirk made it okay to be a Republican. And when he was elected, and of course that same year we elected the first Republican lieutenant governor in the state's history since Reconstruction, Eddie Briggs. But you had members of the legislature that voted Republican in national elections, that believed as the Republican Party believed, but ran as Democrat because everybody else ran Democrat. But after the election of Kirk Fordyce and him coming to the Capitol, that's when you really started seeing people say, you know what, I identify with him, I support his agenda, and they started moving over to the Republican Party then, and then I think that cycle was completed during the term of the second Republican governor, and that's of Haley Barbour.
We're talking with MDOT Executive Director Brad White, who I've asked this morning to become a political historian. In our first segment, when we get back, we'll actually talk about roads and bridges in Mississippi. We're going to take a brief break, and we will be right back. You're listening to The Sit Down with Russ Latino on MPB Think Radio. We're joined today by MDOT Executive Director Brad White. Brad and I have known each other for a good while, and so I wanted to spend the first segment maybe regaling a little bit of his past. Obviously, he's got an important role in the present, dealing with one of the largest state agencies and overseeing sort of the strategy and vision for one of the largest state agencies in the state at MDOT. I mentioned in the intro that obviously roads and bridges are an important part of all of our lives. We don't live in New York City where we can hop on a sub. We've got to get in our cars and drive to and from work, to and from church, to and from ball games. And so having a safe, reliable system is important for the citizens of Mississippi. It's also important for the economy of Mississippi as we think about how do we grow the economy with new industry. Big part of those considerations are making sure that the infrastructure that's in place works for businesses and our need to grow. I did want to mention before we hop into the legislative session and what Brad's focused on, that Germaine Flood is back in the booth for me. She wasn't in the booth when we started the show. I didn't want people to think that I was not giving you your due. Germaine, how are you?
Here. I'm doing good. You always give me my due. I'm good, Russ.
Good. You have a good New Year and Christmas break?
I did. I hung out and I did nothing but receive beautiful gifts and give gifts.
There's something to be said for that, right? And now we have to shake off all those cobwebs,
right,
all that rust, and get back to doing the business that we do.
Right. I'm glad, though, we have my former employer here.
Yeah,
it's always good to see a MDOT alumni.
That's right. That's right. I claim MDOT. I do.
We appreciate it. We claim you too.
Thank you, Mr. White.
Off air, we were talking. Germaine previously worked at MDOT on procurement,
Yes.
and she's now this effervescent radio personality, and so
I do it all.
I like to think that you're in the right place, Germaine.
Thanks, Russ.
Brad, obviously you're recently wed. How was Christmas as a married man?
Congrats.
Very busy. You know, both of our parents are divorced, so we had double the fun. We had Christmas from Tuscaloosa to Harrisville, Mississippi, Delo, Grenada. But it was neat to have Christmas morning wake up with two little boys that were excited to see what Santa brought. And it was real good.
That's awesome, man.
But I'm a creature of habit, so I was glad to see the holidays move on and us start getting back into a routine again.
And I've gone back and forth over this over the years on this. There's a part of me that really wishes the legislature wouldn't come back into session until mid-January or even the beginning of February. Allow people who are around the state capitol and around this business that is politics an opportunity to breathe after the holidays. There also is a part of me, though, that says there is something about that hard stop. Right. It's like, okay, it's time to go to work, right? And so I get your point there. Obviously, the legislature gavelled back in yesterday to start the session for the year. I think there are a lot of big issues on the table. We saw yesterday a lot of sort of momentum and conversation around both the governor and Speaker Jason White obviously saying they want to make a push to eliminate the income tax. That's been a conversation that's been going on for a long time. You've got conversations around access to health care. You've got conversations around the state retirement system. So lots of big questions out there. But every year there is some conversation or some question about our road and bridge system. It's sort of a core function of government. And I wanted to give you an opportunity maybe to give folks that are listening some update on the progress that's been made, and then maybe we can hop into what are the big priorities for the agency itself moving into this session.
Well, when I was hired as director, some of the objectives that we had was to bring more transparency to the agency, to bring more efficiency to the agency, to try to get more money to the projects that people, the taxpayers, expect to see the agency deliver, and because we run a federal program, to make sure that we were maximizing the use of federal dollars that were available to the state. I feel like we've done a good job of that, and over the course of the last 3.5 years, we've built up the confidence of the legislative leadership and the governor to the point that they now feel comfortable investing in the Department of Transportation and knowing that the money that they give us will get to the roads and bridges and all the other modes of transportation that their constituents utilize. The taxpayers of Mississippi have an asset that is valued at over $66 billion when you place value on the bridges and the interstates and the highways that we have around the state. It's about 33,000 miles of roadway, which will build a highway all around the equator of the earth and still have enough roadway left to build a highway from Jackson to Honolulu. We have over 5,000 bridges that we're responsible for.
Which would be expensive, by the way.
That's exactly right. And we have a budget of about $1.4 billion a year with which we try to maintain that and also try to add efficiency to it. So we run two main programs, if you think about it. We try to maintain and rehabilitate the existing system, but we're also charged with the responsibility of looking at that system and saying, where do we need to make it more efficient? When you look at areas like Gluckstadt or I-55 in DeSoto County, I-10 along the coast, other areas around Jackson where you have a lot of congestion, where do we need to build bypasses? Where do we need to turn 2 lanes into 4 or 4 lanes into 6 to allow the traffic to move more safely, more efficiently, and quicker? The problem that we've had is we have not, as a state, looked at the funding of transportation in a significant way since 1987, which was the last time they adjusted the fuel tax. And as a result of that, there's been times in our state's past where we went over a decade with no capacity program because all the money we had to be devoted to the maintenance of the system, which is what the federal government insists you do, or you lose the federal money.
And just for clarity, when you say capacity, you're talking essentially about new roads.
New roads.
Or new lanes.
Widening, anything that would, where the traffic currently on that road, the roadway is no longer able to handle with efficiency the amount of traffic it has, so we add to the capacity of the road. So it's new construction, you're right.
I interrupted you.
No, but long story short is we've not really, as a state, looked at that since 1987. And that was when they raised the fuel tax for the last time. So we're working on a 35-year-old funding model. Now, unlike some of my predecessors, I'm not one of these MDOT directors that says we need to raise the fuel tax. 1 cent of fuel tax generates about $23 million. We get about 17 or 18 million of that. We need the money, but I feel like that there's a need to move to a more modern, more diversified funding model where you collect money from various sources and collectively you come up with whatever the deficit is that we're experiencing that we need in order to properly maintain and hit the metrics the federal government gives us while being able to keep the capacity program alive. What other states have done is they've looked at things like what we call here the use tax. They have gaming revenue. They have other fees that are adjusted that collectively provide that funding source, so you're not just hitting the taxpayer at the pump with everything. So I'm hopeful that this session, that's a long way around the barn in saying that I'm hopeful that this will be the session that we actually have some meaningful conversation about what does that need to look like? How do we responsibly put together the revenue stream necessary in a recurring fashion to fund this core function of government, but do so in a way that's not overly burdensome to the taxpayer. And fortunately, I think Trey Lamar has a concept that he's looking at on redoing the whole tax code, basically, that would net the state a significant tax decrease, but that would still try to find a manner in which to fund our transportation needs. So I'm anxious to see where these conversations go.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of the question for a lot of folks. If you look at the conversation yesterday about income tax elimination, that I think a lot of people sort of have the reaction of, it would be great if I didn't have to pay income taxes. But then how do we make sure that we continue to fund things like roads and bridges or education or whatever that looks like? I think there's probably an answer to some of those concerns, but it's something that you've got to be thoughtful about, right? You've got to make sure that when you are talking about a core function of government, that you're not dropping the ball on that. And so it will be interesting to see how all these different pieces come together. One of the things that I think most people really don't understand, I mean, first of all, your system is complicated, and some of the complication is a federal complication,
right?
In terms of what you're required to do, the hoops you're required to jump through, because as you mentioned earlier or alluded to, it's in a lot of ways it's a federal program, the highway program. Talk a little bit to the average listener about the different sort of categories of roads in Mississippi, what MDOT's responsible for, what local governments are responsible for, and kind of where those dividing lines are.
If it has a number, more than likely we're responsible for it. Like I-55, all the interstates we're responsible for. If you take U.S. Highway 49, the two-lane roads like where I'm from, Highway 540, if it has a number significant like that, then we're probably responsible for it. But what you were talking about with the way that we run our program is we basically run a reimbursement program. And what we try to show to the legislature is it's not only important that we receive money to implement the program, but how we receive it is very important. Because we keep a bank account that's got about $150 million in it in any given day, but it's kind of like the water in a river. It's not the same money that was there the day before or will be there the next day. It's constantly going out. The federal dollars that we get, which make up more than half of our budget, Congress just doesn't send that to us and put it in a bank account for us to spend. We have to spend the state-generated tax dollars first, and we have to spend it in a way that shows the Federal Highway Administration that we're building a highway system that meets their standards, that follows their regulations, and then when they're satisfied that that's happening, they reimburse us with the federal money Congress has assigned to our state. And so it's a constant money out, money in type program. So being able to convince the legislature that you've got to recognize that it's not just that we need the money, but we need it in a recurring fashion so that we can plan years out, we can budget for projects. Contractors that are the ones that we have to rely on in the private industry to deliver the project, a contractor's not willing to go take a $2 million loan out on a crane if he can't see that the business is going to be there, the work will be there for the years into the future that will allow him to meet the note on that crane. So how we receive the money is very important. And hopefully, like I said, this session, this is the first session that I've seen real movement toward trying to identify a funding source that will come in a recurring fashion that will come into the Department of Transportation to push this project, this movement out. I mean, inflation hit everybody. It really hit us. We've got the same amount of money going into pavement, but you're seeing less projects being awarded around the state. And what that means is over time, if that is allowed to continue, our metrics with our performance targets that the Federal Highway Administration puts on us will start suffering. And as soon as our highway system, the status of them, start falling further from good to fair and fair to poor, the next thing you know, we're going to be back where we were in 2018 with local bridges, where the federal government's saying, hey, we're not sending you any more federal money until you come up with a plan to deal with these issues.
We're talking to MDOT Executive Director Brad White about Mississippi's roadways and also how we pay for Mississippi's roadways. My takeaway, in part from what Brad just said, is if you fall into a giant pothole on a road that is not numbered, it's not his fault.
That's right.
Russ.
It has a name,
So-
like Jupiter Road or something like that.
That's not Brad's fault. We're going to be back in just a moment, and we'll talk a little bit more about what the legislature is considering and what it'll mean for you. You're listening to The Sit Down with Russ Latino. We're talking today with MDOT Executive Director Brad White. Before the break, we were talking a little bit about some of the differences in the road systems within Mississippi, and I just want to put a quick fine point on it, is that ultimately you guys are responsible for highways and interstates, MDOT
That's
is.
correct. Yeah.
And then you've got this sort of middle ground system that states support.
State aid road program, but the county supervisors still run that. State aid is of the office of the governor. They receive funding through the fuel tax and all of that as well, but that money primarily goes on state and city, county and city bridges and roadways.
And then there is a segment where local governments are just supposed to be responsible for roads.
City streets, city councils, aldermen are responsible for them. Same with your normal county roads, your board of supervisors run it.
So I say that because I think oftentimes when you hear complaints about roads, which is not to say that MDOT doesn't have things it's working on to improve as well, but very frequently when you hear people say things like, well, Jackson is Beirut, those are not roads that MDOT is responsible for from a funding perspective, from an operational perspective.
Yeah, we receive a lot of complaints on systems that we just don't have jurisdiction over. I think given the tools that we have, our team does a really good job of doing the best we can and making the money go as far as it can. But ultimately, yeah, everybody think when they see any kind of pavement or even a gravel roads, we've received complaints on those. They think Department of Transportation handles that.
Yeah, it's interesting too because you were talking about the gasoline tax or the fuel tax. Obviously, back in 16 and 17, there was some conversation about, do we need to raise the gasoline tax in Mississippi? Right now, it's 18.4 cents a gallon?
Right.
I'll say this, too. I remember having a conversation with a lady during that conversation about whether or not to raise it, and she was insistent, I don't pay a gas tax. And I think it's because it doesn't show up on a receipt, right? That those types of excise taxes are just included in whatever you see as a price per gallon. And so people don't even realize sometimes that that's there. And then the federal gas tax is another 18.4, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
And it's proven to be insufficient in allowing us to really take care of the needs that we have. But what Congress does, when I worked for Senator Cochran, we would receive a memo that told us what the deficit was or what the shortfall was in the Highway Trust Fund, and Congress would just appropriate a pot of money to go and make them whole. The legislature can't do that or doesn't do that. So that's our issue. But I go back to, this is 2025, not 1987, and I think that we've got to think in a more modern way. I don't think it's smart for us to try to put all of our eggs in the one basket of the fuel tax. I think that we should think in a more diversified manner. One, because it's a easier way to come up with a collective amount we need, but two, I think you can be more responsible in how you place that burden back on a taxpayer to where it's not going to hurt them. When we're looking at $480 million a year maintenance shortfalls and 1 cent of fuel tax generates for us $17 million, I don't think you can raise the fuel tax enough to make up that amount of money.
Without significantly hurting people,
That's
right?
right.
I mean, 'cause
that's exactly right.
You and I have had this conversation before, but I grew up in a family where it was not unusual to go to a gas station and have my mom hand me $2 or $3 because that's what she had to go and get $2 or $3 worth of gas, and we'd get as far as long as we could on that. That you still have folks in Mississippi in those situations that are trying to get to and from work, and at some level, what you're saying makes sense. That you want to make sure that however we fund it, we're not making it impossible for those people to get to and from work.
Right.
At some level, too, it just strikes me, after 11 years, I just got rid of my car. It had gone over 200,000 miles. It was about to clunk out. I got an EV, right? Mm-hmm. And so I know a lot of people in Mississippi, that's a dirty word, but I love it. It's fast. It's cool. I'm not paying fuel tax. Right? I'm paying a little fee once a year, but it's probably not equivalent to what I would be paying in fuel tax, but I'm still using those roads. So at some level, what you're saying makes sense, is that we've got to realize that the way that people are driving, the types of vehicles they're driving are going to change in a way that it doesn't make sense to solely rely on that one stream.
Correct. And it's not just people like you that have the EVs or the hybrids, but people like me, my vehicle gets far better gas mileage than the first vehicle I ever had 30 years ago. And so you're not going to collect the amount of money that you used to do. So, I mean, it's just time that we modernize the system. And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the Republican Party. You can't have a tax. The government cannot have a penny that they don't first take from somebody else. But I do think there are certain services that our taxpayers expect government to give them. They expect to be kept safe with law enforcement. They expect to be able to get to and from work. And it's like we try to convince the leadership of the legislature. They can talk all day long about public education, and I'm all for that. I have 3 sisters. They're all in public education system as teachers and guidance counselors. But it doesn't matter how good the schools are if the school buses can't cross our bridges. And they can talk all day long about how important health care is, but it doesn't matter what kind of health insurance you have if your ambulance gets stuck on I-55 on its way to the hospital. So this is a core function of government, and I think it's one of the things that the taxpayers expect their government to deliver to them. But, sometimes we're found to be in a position kind of like Moses and the Hebrew children that were making bricks without straw. I mean, at some point, there's got to be an investment into that for us to be able to do the job that we're expected to complete.
So I think some people, first of all, what you're saying makes sense. And I'd get maybe a little wonky with you in like the old Milton Friedman sort of idea of what government's role was.
Right.
It's essentially those things that the private sector cannot do.
Right.
Right. And so the private sector has never figured out a way collectively to create a road system accessible to the public. And so at some level, that's a necessary function of government. There's certainly other things that government does that you can make an argument the private sector actually does a better job of
Right.
and more efficiently. You and I have talked about this, but if you were to look at just the appropriations that were done last year to MDOT's budget, you might walk away with the perception that the legislature appropriated to MDOT the $1.4 billion you mentioned, plus another 800 or so million for a total appropriation of $2.2 billion. Talk a little bit about why that could be misleading if you just heard that $2.2 billion number.
Right. Well, for example, I've heard Lieutenant Governor Hoseman give that report where they've given the Department of Transportation $2.4 billion or $2.whatever billion dollars. And that's true. But when they have given us, over the last 3 years, they've given us close to $750, $800 million in one-time money for construction projects. That money is not all paid out at one time. It's paid out over the life of these projects. And some of those projects have yet to be awarded to a contract. We have them pending. So every year the legislature, they not only grant us funds, but they have to grant us the authority to use the funds. And so what you'll see is we'll have an appropriation bill that'll pass that'll be, reaching toward $3 billion. But that's not what we're going to spend in a year. That's not what's available to us. That's just giving us the authority to use the money that's been appropriated to build these big projects that they've been interested in the past. And even when you look around the state agencies, our budget is considerably larger than most state agencies. But with $1.5 billion, we're expected to maintain a $66 billion asset, billion-dollar asset. And so, that money doesn't go as far as what people consider. We've had people actually think that we had cut our paving program. And we had to pull our financial data to give to the Legislative Budget Office to show the legislative leadership that we have the same dollar amount going into paving and rehabilitating our system that we've always had. It's just simply that the cost of doing business has gone up. The cost of equipment, the cost of goods, the cost of material, the cost of labor has all increased. And so those dollars do not go as far as they used to, so we're not paving as many roads. We're not rehabilitating as many highways, miles, as what we had scheduled or what we would like.
Yeah, so my recollection is that you guys are, I guess, the third largest agency in the state. Medicaid is number one by far. I think Medicaid's over $8 billion. When you add up the federal and the state money, with about $1 billion in state money that goes into that. And then education obviously comes in second. I think actually a lot of people would be surprised to learn that the Medicaid program is more than twice as big in terms of expenditure to what we spend in terms of education.
Right.
And then I think you guys are third based on my back of the napkin
mental
math.
Health may be ahead of us somewhere.
Okay.
But yeah, but we are.
So one of the things that you mentioned is like you guys would like to see a more stable funding stream based on multiple different sources, as I understand this idea of a diversified revenue model. Is one of those sources the lottery? I know a couple years ago the legislature did something with the lottery towards MDOT, right?
Right. We received the first $80 million that the lottery generates, and the commissioners have decided to put 100% of that on the two-lane highways around the state. And since its inception, we've rehabilitated about 3,500 miles of two-lane road around the state, which is important because a lot of those two-lane highways are the main street of a lot of towns, like Old Highway 49 that goes right through Mendenhall, my hometown, or New Hebron or in other areas that have those 2-lane roadways. But yeah, it's been a significant help, but it's one of a few things that the legislature's done in the recent years to try to help our funding.
You know, I think sometimes you were talking about capacity projects, and you mentioned DeSoto County and you mentioned Gluckstadt. A lot of people hear the areas that are getting those projects, and I think cynics or people who maybe would look at it and say, oh, Brad White, former Republican Party chairman, head of MDOT, is he only giving road projects to Republican areas? I think there's this sort of almost idea sometimes that you're like Huey Long. You know, Huey famously would run roads up to the edge of a town, and depending on how they vote would decide whether or not to finish the road. Give the response to some of that criticism. That
the good news is, with regard to our maintenance of the system, we have federal regulations that removes politics. The commissioners, the elected commission, they cannot say we're going to rehabilitate this road and not this one. It's all based on the data that's collected to show the condition of the roadways. We along with Federal Highway, evaluate all the interstates every year. We evaluate the rest of the highway system every other year. And based on the condition of the pavement, the programs are outlined that say these are your priorities. Now, with regard to the big construction projects, the elected commission is responsible for saying, all right, these are going to be our priorities. Our needs list is about $9 billion, you know, in totality, and they have about $120 million a year that we put into cash flow in these projects. So they have a huge list to pick from, but it's the elected commissioners that say, all right, here are our priorities, and this is where we're going to put them. So if you look at the projects that the legislature has given us the money to escalate, I mean, they're across the state. You have the DeSoto County I-55, you have Tippah County on Highway 15, Union County, Pontotoc County. In that area, you've got Highway 61, 4-laning in Washington County that we're doing pre-construction work on. We've got Highway 19 in Neshoba. You've got Highway 27 that goes from Copiah through Hines that we're looking at a widening project. And then you've got Highway 49, I-10, I-110 all over the coast in South Mississippi, Highway 57 in Jackson County. There's a hurricane evacuation that we have under construction. So while we're certainly not able to hit all the needs that we'd like to hit, I do think that the commission does a good job of making sure that we're trying to cover as many areas in the state as possible.
And I guess maybe what I was alluding to before we go to break is that I would assume that you guys have some criteria that you use to determine where capacity these new projects are most needed based on traffic.
Well, it's required by state law. In 2001, the legislature passed Division 21 law that made the commission have to spread on its minutes the justification for any capacity project. So economic development opportunities may apply to it, but also it has to show that the volume of traffic on the roadway is exceeding the capacity of the roadway. And so they have to spread that on their minutes to provide justification for whatever they spend their money on.
We're talking with MDOT Executive Director Brad White on the Sit Down with Russ Latino right here on MPB Think Radio. We will be back in just a moment. You're listening to The Sit Down with Russ Latino on MPB Think Radio. We're talking today with MDOT Executive Director Brad White, still with us. I hadn't run him off just yet. Look, there's 6 minutes left for you to get really angry and leave.
No, I'm good.
Good. Glad to hear it. We've been talking about this idea that you've got around diversified revenue streams for MDOT. And really, I guess, if I could try and summarize it in my layman terms, you're trying to make sure that there's a sustainable funding source so that when you're like talking to the federal government about road projects that you would like their support on, you're able to show that the state is doing its side of the equation.
Right. Well, Congress, the way the federal program works is Congress authorizes the Federal Highway Administration every 5 years. So, in other words, they issue what you could consider a contract with every state and territory in the union that says, here's the dollar amount by year that we're going to make available to you for the purpose of maintaining and building out your highway and interstate system. So we're able to plan, we're able to schedule projects, we're able to build it, but more importantly, so are our partners in the private sector. They're able to build up the employment that they need to carry out the work that's going to come. They're able to buy the equipment they need and know that they can rest assured that they'll be able to hit the note on each piece of equipment as they pay it out. So for years, that's the way across the country that the highway and interstate system was funded, was through a recurring stream of revenue that could be accounted upon, could be planned out based upon year after year after year. So when the legislature started working with us to try to give us more tools to do our job, they helped us considerably by giving us a lot of one-time money that we saw was best used not on a recurring expense, but on these big projects that we were about to have ready to build out. And as a result, we've got close to $1 billion worth of construction that'll be going to the streets over the next few years, thanks to their investment. But when you look at the program, that doesn't solve the bigger problem, which is insufficient money to be able to spend out and know that you're going to be able to draw down the federal dollars necessary to implement the whole program. And it also doesn't allow the private sector the ability to say, okay, we're confident that the work's going to be there, so we're about to build up in preparation of being able to help MDOT deliver the product to the taxpayer. So that's what I'm talking about when I say it's not just important that we get the money, but how we get it's important.
Yeah, I think one thing that's a tendency of a lot of legislatures, this is not just Mississippi, I think this happens across the country, is a lot of times, and I don't think there's anything that's malintent in this, but a lot of times legislators view themselves as sort of a safekeeper or a guard of the public tax dollars, which they should be. But that results in a situation where instead of looking at something in a systematic way and saying, hey, we want to develop a system that consistently provides what's needed, they almost look at your needs as an agency as a one-off. It's like, okay, we hear the demand that's coming in. Let's scurry up and find an extra $100 million somewhere for this year without really addressing how do we make this something that is recurring, that provides that stable base. And candidly, it doesn't just occur with MDOT. I mean, at some level, some of the PERS conversation, I'm not asking you to opine on this, but some of the PERS conversation looks like that, where you're looking at state retirement. They've got a $25 billion unfunded liability, and occasionally the legislature will elect to put a little extra money into the system, but that doesn't solve the bigger problem of how you make it sustainable. And so it sounds like in part what you're saying is, like, you're not looking for the legislature to surrender oversight. In a lot of ways, it sounds like what you're looking for is assurance that, year in and year out, the resources are going to be there that allow you to get the job done without having it be a one-off thing here and there.
That's correct. And look, we're required by law to provide the legislature with a 3-year plan that shows where every penny that we have is obligated to. Now, that is a snapshot in time, depending on the cost of goods and doing business determines whether or not we're able to meet everything that's in the booklet. But we're accountable to the legislature in the most transparent way that you can be, probably more so than most of the other state agencies, because they receive a plan that shows where every penny we have goes.
It will be interesting to see how all this unfolds, particularly in the context of bigger conversations that are going on around tax reform with income taxes, with the sales tax on groceries, all of these questions that the legislature will try and do. all at once in a 3-month session while walking and chewing bubble gum at the same time. 5 quick questions for you, Brad. Sweet tea or unsweet tea?
Sweet tea.
That's the only good answer, by the way. We've had some people say unsweet tea.
There's none other good
and
answer.
I've judged them for it. All right. What are you reading right now?
Book called The Allies by Garrett Broom, I believe is his last name. I may have the first name wrong, but it looks at Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin and their relationships. And I'm a big World War II buff, and
you've not developed an opinion that Churchill was the actual bad guy, have you?
I believe quite the contrary.
So do I.
Only one that had the right answers.
Biscuits or cornbread?
Depends. I like them both.
You look down at your speedometer on your car. You're driving 95 miles an hour. Hypothetically, what are you jamming out to?
Probably George Jones or Jerry Lee Lewis or some old country.
One gym in Mississippi people should know about.
Crochelle's out on Highway 80.
There we go.
I think it's a good place to go eat.
You've been listening to The Sit Down, a production of Mississippi Public Broadcasting, Think Radio, funded by generous contributions from listeners like you. Today's show was produced by Germaine Flood. We've been joined by Brad White. I hope that you'll stick around for Southern Remedy coming up right after this at 11 a.m. And we'll be back next week for the new episode of The Sit Down on Wednesdays at 10 a.m. right here on NPB Think Radio. Happy New Year.